Oakland, California, late autumn 1964. 7 men were inside that training room, and by the time it ended, 2 of them refused to speak about it again. Bruce Lee never documented the exchange. No fotograf surfaced. No official record was kept. But 3 separate accounts, given years apart, described the same moment. A heavier man, nearly twice Lee's weight, stepping forward and telling him calmly, "You're fast but not powerful." What followed lasted less than 10 seconds. One witness said it ended too quickly to understand. Another said it went on longer than it should have. All agreed on one detail: the sound, something between a body folding and air being forced out of lungs too fast. The larger man did not fall immediately, and Bruce Lee did not look relieved when it was over. What happened in those 6 seconds was never repeated in public, but it changed how at least one man in that room understood him, and according to later accounts, how Bruce Lee understood himself. The method was never explained. Only the result was remembered. By late 1964, Bruce Lee was operating in a narrow space between recognition and rejection. He had already demonstrated unusual speed and coordination, most notably earlier that year in Long Beach, but demonstrations were not enough. Within the martial arts community, especially among Chinese instructors in Northern California, reputation was not built on exhibitions. It was built on controlled encounters, private assessments, and word carried by witnesses who did not exaggerate. And the word around Bruce Lee was unsettled. He was young, just 23. He spoke directly, sometimes too directly, and he was teaching methods that stripped away what others had spent decades preserving. At the Oakland school, co-run with James Yim Lee, the training looked different from what most expected. There were no long sequences of traditional forms being practiced for hours. Instead, students drilled short combinations repeatedly, straight punches, low kicks, interception drills. Timing over tradition. Efficiency over appearance. Some saw this as evolution. Others saw it as disrespect. A local instructor, who later refused to be named in any record, reportedly described Lee's approach as incomplete and dangerous for students who don't understand what's missing. That criticism carried weight, because in that era, martial arts instruction was tied closely to cultural identity. To remove elements was not just technical, it was personal. Challenges began to surface. Not formally, not publicly, but through quiet conversations, someone asking if Lee would demonstrate under pressure, or whether his methods could hold up without cooperation. Most of these never materialized into anything serious. But each request added pressure, because Bruce Lee was not just defending himself. He was defending an idea that speed, timing, and directness could overcome size and durability without relying on rigid systems. That idea had limits, and everyone knew it. Oakland, at the time, was not an easy place to test such a theory. The city's docks and industrial areas produced men accustomed to physical strain, men who did not train for precision, but for endurance and impact. Among them were informal fighters, boxers, wrestlers, street-tested individuals who valued what worked under resistance, not what looked correct. If Lee's approach failed against that kind of pressure, it would not be dismissed quietly. It would spread, and in a community where reputation traveled faster than explanation, one failed encounter could define him. James Yim Lee understood this better than anyone. According to later accounts, he did not encourage these challenges, but he did not prevent them either. He watched. He evaluated. He knew that if Bruce's methods were to survive, they had to be tested under conditions that could not be controlled. Still, there was concern, not about whether Bruce could perform, but about what would happen if the situation went beyond control. Because Bruce Lee, even at that stage, carried something that was difficult to measure. Precision, yes. Speed, unquestionably. But also a level of intensity that, under the wrong conditions, could escalate faster than intended. One former student later described it carefully. He didn't just react. When he committed, everything went with it. And if the other person didn't stop, there was a question of how far he would go. That question had not yet been answered in Oakland. Not against someone who could absorb punishment. Not against someone who would keep moving forward after being hit clean. and not in a room small enough that there would be no space to disengage if things went wrong. By the time this particular challenge was arranged, the stakes were no longer theoretical. It was no longer about proving speed. It was about whether control could be maintained once speed stopped being enough. Because if it couldn't, then everything Bruce Lee was building in that small Oakland school would begin to collapse under its own claims. And there would be witnesses. The man who stepped into that room was not unknown, but he was not formally documented either. His name appears in fragments across accounts. Frank Calderon, sometimes shortened to Frank C. In two separate testimonies, he is referred to only by a nickname, the Ox. The name was not given lightly. At the time of the encounter, Calderon was working the Oakland docks, long shifts involving cargo loading, rope handling, and manual lifting that build a specific kind of strength. Not refined, not symmetrical, but dense and functional. Estimated weight, between 270 and 280 pounds. Height, just under 6 feet. Reach, average, but his shoulders compensated for it. Witnesses consistently described his posture the same way. Slightly forward, chest heavy, arms relaxed until needed. Not the stance of a traditional martial artist. More like someone accustomed to absorbing impact and continuing anyway. He had some boxing experience, local gyms, no formal record, but enough to understand distance, timing, and how to throw a punch without hesitation. More importantly, he had experience taking hits. One account from a sparring partner, given years later, described it bluntly. You could land clean on him. Not glancing clean, and he wouldn't reset. He'd just keep coming. That changes how you think. That detail mattered, because Bruce Lee's approach depended heavily on interception, stopping an opponent's movement at the moment it began. It worked against speed, against hesitation, against structure, but against forward pressure that didn't break, that was less certain. Calderon's striking was not technical in the classical sense. He favored wide, committed hooks, and short-range body blows. He also used low-line kicks, aimed at thighs and knees, not for speed but to disrupt balance. There was nothing elegant about it, but it had purpose, and it had worked. According to one witness, Calderon had been in multiple unsanctioned bouts, informal, often unrecorded, where endurance mattered more than precision. He had lost some, won others, but he had never been stopped early. That reputation was what brought him into the conversation. This was not a man chosen at random. He represented a specific problem, a body that could absorb impact, a mindset that did not retreat, a willingness to close distance regardless of consequence. More importantly, he did not come in hostile. That detail appears consistently. There was no shouting, no attempt to provoke. When he spoke, it was measured, almost conversational. One witness, H. Sato, recalled the moment before the engagement. He looked at Bruce like he was assessing him for work. Not angry, just unconvinced. The now quoted line, "You're fast but not powerful," was not delivered as an insult. It was an evaluation. That distinction mattered, because it meant Calderon was not trying to win a confrontation out of pride. He was testing a belief, and he expected resistance. What he did not expect, based on later accounts, was how quickly that belief would be challenged. Still, entering that room, the advantage did not appear to be with Bruce Lee. On paper, it leaned heavily the other way. A 23-year-old instructor with unconventional methods, against a man nearly twice his weight, accustomed to impact, with no obligation to respect form or restraint. There were no judges to interpret what happened, no rules to slow it down, and no guarantee that either man would stop once the line was crossed. One of the witnesses would later summarize Calderon's role with unusual clarity. He wasn't there to lose, and he wasn't there to learn. He was there to find out if what Bruce was doing could actually stop someone like him. That was the real test, not speed against size, but structure against pressure that refused to collapse. And once it began, there would be no adjustment period, only reaction. The room was already closed before either man stepped fully inside. Oakland, 1964. Late afternoon light coming through partially covered windows, filtered and uneven. The space itself measured roughly 20 feet wide, maybe 30 in length. The wooden floor showed were in specific areas, darker patches where feet had pivoted repeatedly over time. There was no mat, no boundary, If someone went down, they would meet hardwood. Against the far wall stood a heavy bag, unmoving. A bench ran along the right side, where two of the men sat without speaking. The rest remained standing, spaced deliberately, leaving the center open. 7 in total. No one positioned themselves too close. James Yim Lee stood near the back, slightly offset from the center line. Arms folded, his attention fixed, not shifting between the two men, but staying on Bruce. Watching for something specific, timing, perhaps a restraint. Near the entrance, Sato remained still, one shoulder close to the wall. He would later describe the atmosphere as compressed, noting that even before anything happened, people were already adjusting their breathing. There was no formal announcement. No one explained rules because none had been negotiated. One condition had been stated earlier, outside the room, according to Sato, no weapons. No interference. Everything else was implied. When Calderon stepped forward, the floor gave a slight sound under his weight. Not loud, but noticeable. A shift in pressure. His shoes were standard work footwear, not designed for movement, but stable. He did not remove them. Bruce Lee entered without hesitation, but he did not immediately take position. That detail appears in more than one account. He moved once across the space, slowly, not circling but measuring. His eyes were not fixed on Calderon's face. They moved chest, shoulders, hips, assessing structure, watching how the man carried his weight. Then he stopped. Distance settled at approximately 6 feet. Not agreed upon, just where both men came to rest. Calderon's stance was natural, almost casual. Feet slightly apart, left side marginally forward. His arms hung loose at first, then lifted just enough to suggest readiness. No tight guard, no formal posture. Bruce adjusted twice. First, a slight shift of his rear foot, bringing his base narrower. Then a forward lean, subtle, but enough to place more weight on the lead leg. His hands are not high. One forward, one closer to the body. Not symmetrical. A stance built for interception. No signal was given. What marked the beginning was quieter than expected. According to James Yim Lee, it was a change in breathing. Calderon's chest expanded first. Not exaggerated, just enough. And Bruce saw it. There was no countdown. No, only that shift. The air in the room tightened. Not metaphorically, but physically. Witnesses later described holding their breath without realizing it. The kind of silence where small movements become louder. A foot adjusting, fabric shifting, air entering lungs. Time not slow, but attention sharpened. Every detail began to matter. Calderon made the first commitment, not with a strike, but with a step. His lead foot moved forward, closing distance by nearly half in a single motion. Not fast, but decisive. The kind of step that removes space rather than tests it. Bruce did not retreat. That choice registered immediately. Instead, he shifted slightly to his right, no more than a half step, changing the angle without giving ground. It was a small adjustment, but it redefined the line between them. Now, they were not directly aligned. Now, any forward movement would require correction. Calderon continued anyway. The distance collapsed to within striking range. No words were exchanged, but the tone had changed. Whatever this had been before, a test, an evaluation, a controlled encounter, it was no longer neutral. Because at that range, with no rules to interrupt, the next movement would not be exploratory. It would be committed. The first strike did not come from Bruce Lee. It came from Calderon, immediately after closing the distance he had forced. A right hand, thrown from midline height, traveling in a wide arc toward Bruce's head. Not precise, but not careless either. The kind of punch built on confidence that something, anything, in front of it would be hit. There was weight behind it. One witness, Sato, would later estimate the distance it traveled. Less than 2 feet from start to impact range. It wasn't a long swing. It was short, but heavy. Bruce did not step back. He shifted just enough to remove his head from the line, no more than a few inches. The movement was tight, economical. His rear foot anchored, lead foot adjusting slightly to maintain balance. The punch passed close enough that one observer claimed to feel the air move. And in that same moment, before Calderon's arm had fully extended, Bruce responded. A straight lead. No chamber. No visible properación. His lead hand shot forward from where it already was, traveling the shortest possible line. The strike landed high on Calderon's face. Some accounts say the cheekbone, others the area near the mouth. The sound was sharp, but not dramatic. More contact than impact. Calderon's head turned slightly with it, but his body did not stop. That was the first disruption in expectation. Against most opponents, that strike would have created space, either through recoil or hesitation. Here it did neither. Calderon continued forward. His momentum carried him through the contact, reducing the effect of the blow. His left foot planted deeper, bringing his torso closer, inside the range where Bruce's straight-line advantage began to narrow. Bruce adjusted immediately. A second strike followed. Another straight, this one lower, aimed toward the center line of the chest. It connected, but again, the effect was limited. Not ineffective, but insufficient. Calderon absorbed it and closed the remaining distance. Now, they were within arm's length. Too close for extension. Too close for reset. The dynamic shifted. Calderon's left arm moved inward. Not a clean grab, but a sweeping motion meant to disrupt Bruce's positioning. It made partial contact with Bruce's shoulder, enough to alter alignment. At the same time, his right side began to load again, shorter this time, preparing for a compact strike. Bruce did not wait. He angled off, sliding slightly to his right, attempting to regain the line. His footwork was precise, but the space was limited. The room did not allow for wide movement, and Calderon's forward pressure reduced options further. One witness described it as a compression point. Everything was happening within a space no wider than 3 feet. Bruce's third movement was different. Instead of striking high or midline from distance, he adjusted his level, lowering slightly, bringing his center of gravity down. His lead shoulder dipped just enough to change the trajectory of what followed. A short-range strike. Compact. Delivered for within inches. The target, just below the rib line. The impact produced a different sound, duller, internal. Calderon's body reacted. Not dramatically, but visibly. His forward movement paused. For less than a second. That pause mattered, because until that moment, nothing had interrupted his advance. Now, there was a break, but it wasn't complete. He was still upright, still within reach. And now, aware that the previous strikes had not stopped him, but something else had begun to. That realization changed the risk. For both of them, Bruce had found a point of effect, but he had also entered a range where one mistake would eliminate his advantage entirely. Calderon's arms came forward again, this time more directly. Not a swing, a closing motion, an attempt to bring Bruce into contact he could control. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. And for the first time since it began, Bruce Lee was no longer dictating the pace. He was reacting inside it. Once Calderon's arms came forward, the nature of the exchange changed from striking to containment. It was no longer about landing clean shots. It was about whether Bruce could prevent himself from being held in place. Calderon's left arm made contact first, heavier this time, not glancing. It pressed into Bruce's upper right side, just below the shoulder. Not a grip yet, but enough to restrict movement if allowed to settle. His right arm followed, coming inward with less speed but more intent. If both arms closed fully, the size difference would become decisive. Bruce reacted immediately. He dropped his weight further, knees bending, center lowering, reducing the leverage Calderon could apply from above. At the same time, he shifted his torso slightly offline, preventing a full square-up. But the space was collapsing. One witness later described the distance as shoulder to shoulder for a moment, maybe less. From that range, precision had to become smaller. Bruce's next movement was not wide or visible from across the room. It happened inside the contact. A short strike, delivered from close range without extension. The motion was compact, almost hidden by their proximity. Again, the target was the body. This time higher, near the lower edge of the sternum. The effect was immediate, but incomplete. Calderon's forward pressure broke for a second. His torso shifted backward slightly, his breath interrupted, but he did not disengage. Instead, his arms tightened, attempting to complete the clinch before another strike could follow. That was the most dangerous moment, because if the clinch closed fully, Bruce would lose the space required for speed, and Calderon would gain control. James Yim Lee would later recall that Bruce's expression changed at this point, not visibly to everyone, but enough for someone watching closely. He realized he couldn't let it continue. There was no panic, but there was urgency. Bruce disengaged with a sharp lateral step, pulling his upper body free while his lower body pivoted out. It wasn't a retreat in the conventional sense. It was a brief extraction, just enough to create a narrow lane between them. Less than a foot of space. But it was enough. Calderon moved forward again, attempting to close it. And in that instant, before contact could be re-established, Bruce made a decision. Not to continue exchanging, but to end the exchange entirely. The final sequence happened faster than anything before it. One step, not backward but angled. A shift of weight onto the lead leg. And then a strike, delivered along a direct line, without visible wind-up. Witnesses disagree on the exact mechanics. Some described it as a straight punch. Others insisted it carried a slight upward trajectory. One account suggested it was preceded by a minimal deflection, too small to register clearly. What is consistent is the target, midline, upper torso, just below the chest, slightly off-center. And the timing. It landed as Calderon was moving forward. Not after he stopped. During the movement itself. The impact produced a sound different from the others. Not louder, but deeper. Calderon's body reacted immediately. His forward motion halted, not gradually but all at once. His shoulders pulled inward, his posture breaking as if something internal had shifted out of alignment. Air left his lungs in a single, forced exhale. His arms dropped. Not by choice, but because the structure holding them up had changed. He remained standing for a brief moment, long enough for Bruce to step back. And in that space, created not by distance, but by effect, something else became visible. Bruce did not follow. He did not strike again. He watched, not to confirm victory, but to assess whether continuation was necessary. Calderon took one step backward, then another. His knees bent, not collapsing but losing strength. And then he lowered, first partially, then fully, until he was no longer able to remain upright. The room remained silent. No one moved immediately, because what had just happened was not a flurry. It was a resolution, and it had come at a point where continuation would have meant something else entirely. Something less controlled. Bruce remained where he was, breathing steady but not relaxed, watching the man in front of him, not as an opponent now, but as a variable that had finally stopped moving. The decision had been made in a fraction of a second. Not just how to end it, but when to stop. And that line, between necessary force and excess, had come closer than anyone in the room had expected. For several seconds after Calderon went down, no one in the room moved. Not out of hesitation, but because it wasn't immediately clear what state he was in. He had not been knocked unconscious. His eyes were open, but his body had withdrawn inward, shoulders rounded, arms close to his torso, breathing uneven and shallow. Each inhale came delayed, as if the signal to breathe had to travel farther than usual. Sato was the first to shift position. He stepped off the wall slowly, not rushing, watching for signs of instability. Later, he would describe Calderon's condition with precision. He wasn't dazed. He was interrupted, like something inside had shut down for a moment and hadn't fully come back. James Yim Lee remained where he was. His attention stayed on Bruce, because Bruce had not relaxed. That detail appeared in every account. He had stepped back immediately after the final strike, creating space, but his posture remained set. Not aggressive, not advancing, but still prepared. His hands had lowered slightly, but not fully. His breathing was controlled, but measured, deliberate. He was waiting, not for approval, but for confirmation that it was over. Calderon shifted after a few seconds, rolling slightly to one side, drawing a deeper breath. The sound was strained, but more stable. He placed one hand on the floor, testing his weight, but did not attempt to stand. One of the seated men moved closer, crouching near him, asking something quietly. Calderon responded with a short nod. No one asked Bruce anything. There was no declaration of outcome. The result was understood without being stated. After approximately a minute, Calderon managed to sit upright, supported briefly, then independently. His breathing had normalized enough to speak, though no full account of what he said exists. One witness recalled only a single phrase, spoken low, felt that. He did not attempt to continue. That, more than anything, ended it. Bruce turned away before anyone addressed him. He walked toward the far side of the room, not quickly, not dramatically. His posture had changed slightly, less tension in the shoulders, but not ease. He placed his hands on his hips for a moment, then let them drop. James Yim Lee approached him quietly. Their exchange was brief. No one reported the exact words. But Sato, observing from a distance, noted something specific. James didn't look impressed. He looked concerned. That reaction would make more sense later, because the outcome, while decisive, had revealed something that extended beyond technique. Bruce Lee had ended the encounter efficiently, but not effortlessly. The earlier strikes, the clean ones, had not produced immediate results. Calderon had continued forward through them, forcing Bruce into a range where the margin for error narrowed significantly. And in that compressed space, the solution had required more than speed. It had required precision under pressure, and a willingness to apply force at a level that could not be partially committed. That carried implications, not just about what worked, but about what might happen if control slipped. In the days that followed, no public mention of the encounter surfaced. No demonstration referenced it. No formal record was kept. But internally, something shifted. According to later accounts from students, Bruce began adjusting aspects of his training, placing greater emphasis on ending engagements quickly, reducing prolonged exchanges, and refining his understanding of distance under pressure. Not because the encounter had gone poorly, but because it had come closer to losing structure than he was willing to accept. Calderon did not reappear in any further accounts. There is no record of him seeking a rematch. No indication of hostility afterward, only that he had participated and stopped. Years later, when fragments of the story were retold among those who had been present, the focus was rarely on the final strike itself. It was on the moment before it. The brief second where continuation would have meant escalation beyond control. One witness summarized it in a way that stayed with the others. He didn't win because he was faster. He won because he recognized the exact point where it had to end, and didn't hesitate when he reached it. Bruce Lee never confirmed the encounter, but those who were in that room did not remember it as a victory. They remembered it as a line, approached, nearly crossed, and then deliberately stepped back from the last possible moment. And in that space between action and restraint, they understood something about him that no demonstration had ever shown. The danger was never in whether he could finish a fight. It was in how precisely he chose not to go any further.